if I was to tell you that to watch this video all the way through, 30 or 40 minutes, might save your child from possibly being involved in the human trafficking business, would you listen? Or, like me, are you that type of parent that thinks, oh, that'll never happen to me? Well, it did happen to me. And my number one problem was that I thought human trafficking was kidnapping a little kid, shoving them in the back of a van, taking them to a room somewhere and locking them up, and somebody coming in and selling them for sex. That's this much of what human trafficking is. Realistically, what it is our daughters and our sons being approached by people while they're living in your homes and convincing them to do this on the sidelines to give them the dreams that they want. I am not kidding. This is terrifying. And if I had known half of what Carly tells us today in this video before I had kids, there's a very good chance that what happened to my daughter might not have happened. Please, I implore you to watch this video, even if you have little ones, because it will help you, educate you on what you need to start doing now, and it will teach you what to look for as they are getting older. It is imperative that as parents, we do what we can to protect our kids. And the only way we can do that is by knowledge. So I'm hoping that you will stay and watch the whole thing. And welcome with me, Carly from Victim Services. Really? Welcome everybody to Parent with Purpose. Today we are talking about the sex trade business. And as parents, this is something we need to make sure we are not burying our heads in the sand about, and that we are learning what we need to learn to protect our children. And today we are so honored to have Carly from Victim Services here in the Durham area to speak to us today because she's an expert. So welcome, Carly.
Thank you for having me.
We talked a little bit before everybody got here about your why that you're actually involved in this. And it's interesting that you say that your mother empowered you want to actually help empower other women.
I want to empower other women to make choices that are best for them and to keep themselves safe, whatever that may be. But if someone is being coerced or forced into this sex trade, of course, that's a different story. And then, of course, we want to do everything to support them in getting the help they need to be okay, to be free, and to make decisions on their own.
All right, so tell me exactly the company and your position that you're working for.
Sure. So I work for Victim Services of Durham Region as the Executive Director, and we're an agency that supports victims of crime, whether or not they report that crime to police, and our services are free of charge, help people in the immediate aftermath of the crime or tragic circumstance that they experience, and we try to help them navigate services and supports to rebuild their lives.
All right, so now, being a mom who has had a little taste of this in our own family, it is dear to my heart, but as a parent, tell us what it is we should be looking for, like education.
So, I think we first need to start by debunking some myths and misconceptions. Because when we're talking today about coercion into the sex trade, which is also called human trafficking, and I think sex work and human trafficking are often conflated, so they're thought of as the same thing when they're not.
Right.
I think of the sex trade as a spectrum of experience, so I call them the 3 C's: choice, circumstance, and coercion. So today we're really talking about coercion, when people are forced, tricked, manipulated, coerced into the sex trade. And the definition of human trafficking is when force, fraud, and coercion are facilitated by a third party or a group of people. So you need someone to traffic you, right? Somebody does this to you.
Right.
If you're under the age of 18, technically you could be in the sex trade and can be considered exploited, even though no one is exploiting you. But really we're focusing on when someone is exploiting you, and they're doing that through the sex trade. That's what the definition of what human trafficking is. The next thing you need to know is that zero movement is necessary in order for human trafficking to take place.
What does that mean?
So in order to understand it, we often think of someone who's brought from one country to Canada, for example, and then they're a foreigner to Canada, and then they're exploited here. Right. That happens, but very rarely. The majority of the human trafficking that exists in Ontario, in Durham, in Canada, and in the U.S. too, I believe, is domestic, which means you can be from the country you're being trafficked in.
Right.
And you can be from Durham and be trafficked in Durham. Zero movement is necessary. You don't have to be brought from one location to another location in order for human trafficking to exist. It's not the same as smuggling, which another thing that's often confused. Another thing that you need to know is most people are trafficked by somebody they know is relational, not by
Seriously?
a stranger. So, so for example, you see in the media of someone who's, walking down the street and they're pulled into a van and the van speeds away. I've probably worked with over 1,000 survivors of human trafficking, and I've heard a story like that only once in my whole career. So what we're seeing much more often is someone who's being trafficked by a friend or a boyfriend or by a family member. And if it's not somebody that you had that relationship with before, that's how they're going to lure you. That's how they're going to get your attention. They're going to become your friend or become your boyfriend, or they're going to feel like they're a parental figure because they're realizing what it is that you're missing in your life, and they're finding a way to offer it to you. It's not a stranger who kidnaps you from the street and sells you into the sex trade. That's just not what happens. And often we hear the story of this much older guy trafficking this much younger girl. That can happen, but again, it's super rare. They're much more closer in age because it has to look to the public and to the person's family like it's a relationship or like it's a friendship or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The more it looks natural, the less suspicious a parent would be. And so these are the things we have to be attuned to when we're talking about human trafficking. So that's really what trafficking is. Like, it's not like I'm going to be like, hey, Linda, I'm going to traffic you. It's not that simple. It's much more like you have to assess the vulnerability of the person you're going to do this to. And so because it's not often a stranger, it's someone you have a little bit lowered boundaries with because you have a relationship with this person or because you have someone in common with this person. They're your friend's friend or they're your friend's cousin or they used to go to your school and they're a few years older than you, or they're hanging out at the mall and you see them regularly and you make eye contact, or you have mutual friends on Facebook, or they start liking all your pictures on Instagram. So you have this lowered level of worry because they're not fully strangers. And then they decide to learn as much as they can about you. So they're going to assess your vulnerability. First thing, they're looking for your vulnerabilities, and I can tell you what some of those vulnerabilities are. I'll go back to that. But they're finding out as much as they can about you. And it doesn't feel like they're interviewing you and checking off all these questions. It feels like, holy shit, no one has ever listened to me like this before.
Cared about me this much.
No one has ever taken the time to learn what it is that I want in my life, why I'm not getting along with my mom, why I'm struggling at school, why I've dropped it, all of those things. That's what they do. They listen to you. And they assess what it is they feel is missing in your life, whether that's a friendship or a relationship or someone who feels like a parental sort of figure. And they'll give you that. They'll make you feel like you hit the jackpot, that you found this person that can take care of you in a way that you thought you would never be taken care of before in your life. And it feels really, really good. And then they're so they're learning all this about you. They understand what it is, what your hopes are. We could have a family together. We could have a life together. We could buy a house. Whatever it is they feel that you've always wanted and you want to find a way to get, they will offer you that. They will sell you this dream. And then they're incredibly loving, amazing. Often we hear the story of girls whose traffickers or boyfriends take them out for dinner, get their hair done, get their nails done, take them shopping. And slowly they're incredibly loving and amazing. They treat you like you hit the jackpot, you won the lottery with this person. They're incredibly loving in a way that you never thought you would ever have before in your life, almost like the way it happens in a movie. And then they pull it away, and they're incredibly loving and amazing, and then they pull it away. They're incredibly loving and amazing, and they pull it away, and you're like, what did I do? I'll do anything to get back into your good books. I'll do anything to make you feel and treat me that way that I know you're capable of treating me like you did before. So you'll do things sexually, you'll lower your boundaries, sexual boundaries, other sort of boundaries, emotional boundaries, that you wouldn't have done before in order to please them, in order to get back into their good books. So they're desensitizing you to certain sexual acts. They're doing this in a way to test you, to see what it is, how far that they can push you to do certain things that you said you were uncomfortable doing before. At the same time as they're doing these things, they're going to have sex with you and then immediately after take you shopping, or have sex with you and immediately after get your hair done. Slowly that gets replaced with having sex with you and then saying, baby, you just made me feel so good. You're so good at this. Here's $40 cash. Go treat yourself. Your brain starts associating sex with a reward, sex with money. And at the same time, you're being desensitized to certain sexual acts. So all this is happening at once. In addition, the third thing that traffickers or pimps, use those words interchangeably, are really good at is they're isolating you and confining you. And they're not doing that usually by physically confining you. They're doing that by deleting text messages from mothers who are reaching out to their kids. Or, when you're in a really loving, caring relationship when you're a teenager, you often, say, I'll give you my password to my social media, if you, like the ultimate level of trust passwords. And they're literally, we hear this often, they go on and they delete the messages of the friends and the family that are reaching out to you and saying, I'm worried about you, how are you, what's going, and so you feel like you only have this person to rely on. Or, they'll emphasize, I heard your friend calling you a bitch behind your back, and do you know what I mean? Yeah. They try to break every positive social relationship you have in order for you to solely rely on them. And then the full-on exploitation sets in. They've broken down your spirit, they've broken down your self-esteem, and then they introduce the idea of being involved in the sex trade. It could look insidious, and they trick you into doing it, or it could be really direct. That stuff I just bought for you and got for you, and I was taking care of you. You think that was free? You now owe me. Or, that house we could have together, that family we could start, you'd only have to make this much money. I have this crazy idea. No, you're never going to go for it. And you're like, no, tell me. We'd only have to do it for this long. You'd make this much money. No one would have to know. Once they have one naked picture of you, you can say, I'll post it on social media. I'll send it to your mom. I'll send it to your, And often you think of, physical violence being associated with human trafficking. It is associated, but it's much more used as a tool to instill fear. If you leave, you know what I'm capable of doing. Don't leave. And most people are like, well, if you're in a hotel, you could just run down to the lobby and tell the receptionist, I'm being trafficked, help me. It's just not that simple. You're not usually physically locked in a room. You can be. I have heard stories of being physically locked, but much more often you're not.
What keeps in there then?
Yeah, it feels like there's a fence around your brain. You feel like, I know what this person is capable of doing to me physically if I leave. You know that you feel the stigma and the potential outing if he sends that picture or he shares that picture or he posts that picture online. Most of all, you're like, who is ever going to love me and take care of me like this again? Wow. And that terrifies you. So you don't leave because of all of those reasons, that being the biggest one.
How do they confuse that as a real relationship? Like when it's all said and done and they actually are understanding that they're selling their bodies for this sexual act, for this person who supposedly loves them, how do they get to the point in their head where they haven't been able to see that as pure manipulation?
They believe that the money they're making, he's holding every cent, by the way,
right,
is going towards their life together. And they believe that it is what you need to do, and he's going to do his part, and whatever that is, rob people, deal drugs, whatever it is, he's doing his part to make his 50%. You're doing your 50%. So you can have this life together. You're in it together, and it's not a long-term plan. You know that this is just a means to get what it is that you've always hoped of and dreamed of, and you're doing it together.
And there's no way that this could happen outside of this relationship.
You have found the person that is finally meeting all of your needs. And why would you potentially lose?
So what makes somebody susceptible to this, and what are parents supposed to be looking out for?
So I think of it as a Venn diagram, so two overlapping circles, right? Mm-hmm. So on one circle would be the individual risk factors, and the other circle would be the systemic risk factors. So individual risk factors are low self-esteem, lack of self-worth, issues at home, when you don't feel adequately loved or supported. Maybe you have a developmental disability. Maybe you've experienced previous abuse. Maybe you're struggling in school. All of those are individual risk factors. The other side of the circle are systemic risk factors, such as being racialized, such as being indigenous, such as being a girl, such as being a newcomer, such as being from a community that has a high proximity to crime, or a community that lacks resources. All those things are completely out of your control and make you vulnerable to anything, really. You could think about the people you know in your life, mostly young women. That's the majority of who is a victim of being trafficking. And you look at those two overlapping circles, the people who you could check off individual risk factors and systemic risk factors are at the highest level, where they overlap, are obviously at the highest level of being trafficked. It's not to say that you can just have individual risk factors. You can also be trafficked.
So could this ever happen to our sons?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually are working with a young man right now who is being trafficked by a man. Mostly happens to young men who identify as being LGBTQ and whose parents kick them out of their house, who are not accepting that they're forced to find support and get their needs met elsewhere.
Right.
And so obviously that vulnerability, it becomes, a risk factor for being trafficked.
One of the main things we need to be doing as parents, and we're aware of this on a regular basis, is constantly encouraging and uplifting and showing our children their value and their worth and their self-esteem. I personally thought I was doing that to my children, and yet I had one who was really struggling with all of this.
Sure.
So as parents, and we're dealing with the teenage pressures, all of they're trying to figure out, the hormones are going crazy, and they're trying to figure out where they fit into their high school, like all that stuff.
It's a lot.
And we know that we went through it, so we know. What can we do specifically to help them?
I get the question all the time, like, how do you end human trafficking? I'll give you a one-word answer, and then I'll expand.
Okay.
Consent. Teach your children about consent, and teach them about consent when they are babies, when they're little, and then you build on that as they get older. I feel a lot of people are like, you're going to talk to your kids about sex when they're 8? And I'm like, no. Sex and consent are not the same thing.
That's right.
You can teach kids about consent without talking about sex. I'll give you an example. I have a 1.5-year-old daughter. We have a hula hoop at home, and her name is Florence. And I say, Florence, who's allowed in your hula hoop? What if they come into your hula hoop and you don't want them in your hula hoop anymore? What if someone comes into your hula hoop without your permission? I taught her the skill without mentioning sex and equipping her with the knowledge of, I get to think about who I want in my hula hoop.
And I can say no.
And I can say no. So there are lots of activities, that's a 2-second activity that you can teach your kids about. That is how you equip them to not be trafficked. I know that sounds like a stretch.
It almost sounds too simple.
It's not too simple, because I'll tell you that 99% of the clients I've supported, and again, I've worked with probably over 1,000 survivors of domestic human trafficking in my career. They all tell me, Carly, I said yes. And I said, no, you didn't. And they're like, no, I said those words, yes, so I consented. I said, well, let me teach you about the definition of consent, because what you learned in school was wrong. It is an incredibly nuanced definition. It doesn't, yes means yes and no means no is not the definition of consent. You cannot give consent under any sort of pressure. So if someone promises you something in return, or if someone says, it would really mean a lot to me if you said yes, or this is what we could do if you said yes, it negates the yes. Most people don't know that.
No.
That's really the definition. There's also other elements that need to be present in order for consent to exist. So for example, you cannot give consent. So number one, you can't give consent under pressure, any sort of pressure. You can't give consent under any sort of influence. So if you're intoxicated, you cannot give consent, of course. If you're passed out, obviously you cannot give consent. Even if you gave consent before and then you pass out, you did not consent. It has to be willing, and it also has to be ongoing. So let's say you can consent one time and then you assume that person would be okay with it the next time. That's also completely untrue. Once you equip people with the knowledge of consent, they realize that they're not consenting, and they realize what's happening to them is in fact wrong. They don't know that this is wrong, then they don't feel like they can say anything about it. That's often the case for survivors of domestic human trafficking. They think, well, I said yes to this, so it's my fault. Who's ever going to love me again once I do it once? It's my fault. The shame and blame that they place on themselves is half the battle. And you can then imagine the parenting side then is if you know your kid is up to no good, but you don't know exactly what they're doing, and you know that they're having sex with random guys, or you know that they're wearing certain clothes, whatever it is, and your red flags are going off, but you don't know they're being trafficked. You can imagine your parenting intervention would in fact be the opposite of what it should be. So I'll give you an example. They're like, well, my mom says I'm such a slut, and if I keep coming home past curfew, I'm going to be locked out of the house. To say to those parents, that's the opposite of what you should be saying to your kids. Right. You need to say, I don't care what it is that you're doing. I love you, I love you, I love you. Just come home. I won't ask you questions about it. You don't need to tell me about it. Just make sure that your kids are safe. The second they feel judged by you, you've closed the door for them to disclose to you that maybe this wasn't their own choice. maybe they didn't consent.
I can tell you from a parent's point of view, and I've got 4 adult children now, so we've been through the teenage years 4 times. That's a hard thing to ask us to do, because we ask the questions under the assumption that we are getting facts so we can help protect. So that's a hurdle for us as parents to go, okay, so I'm not supposed to ask any questions, just come home. I get the concept. I get what you're saying.
Okay, so then they've been home, you know that they're safe, then you say to them, what do you need help with? What's going on? I'm really worried about you. Instead of, you've missed your curfew, you're dressing like a slut, you're hanging out with people that are no good. Like, it's just a different approach. It's an approach of empathy and trust and making
Instead of fear.
Instead of fear.
Because honestly, I know some of the things that I've said to my kids was out of pure fear.
Of course.
And I didn't think of it from their side of how they were seeing this.
Which you totally get, right? You totally get. So worried about you.
Yes.
And I want you to feel comfortable telling me, but I get that there are things that you need from me in order for you to feel comfortable. What are those things? Just assuming that they're going to give you that, right?
Yeah, we do, because we're their parents. We just assume that they honestly know we care and love and will do anything for them.
But it is an approach of not judging your kids.
Not judging. As a parent, I mean, there also becomes this fine line with us, and with each child, the age on where this happens is different. But we shouldn't be their friends. Yeah. We need to be their parents. But this approach is more of a friend approach.
I would say no. I agree with you that you need to be their parents.
Right.
But you also need trust, and you need unconditional love, and you need a place for them to feel confident in telling you things.
So how do you deal with the consequence of them breaking a curfew? Because those consequences, the curfew's there for a reason.
Sure.
The consequences to hopefully make that happen. So how do you deal with that?
That's not a question I get often. So I'll think everything is about a conversation. I would ask them, what's so hard about it, about keeping your curfew? What is it about coming home an hour later that's like so much more fun from 11 to 12? Like, what are you doing in that hour? Or is it that it's the rule you want to break? How can we, asking them, to me, everything is about giving them a chance to advocate and explain their point of view instead of having an arbitrary rule for no reason. And so that's what I would do if with my kid. I would say, I want to get it. Explain it to me, because obviously this isn't working. And from 11 to 12, I'm lying in bed, with my nail, I'm terrified. I feel sick to my stomach that I don't know where you are. What can we do to make sure that you can get home in time, and so that I know you're okay, while you can still have fun? It's not about changing your rule. It's about them feeling comfortable talking to you, and that's on you as a parent, right? Kids aren't going to just, you have to be the ones as parents.
You have to think outside of the box to fix the problem.
I think if you had that conversation with a kid and say, I want to get it. I'm not going to change my mind, but I really want to get it so that from 11 to 12, I know where you are.
As in all things parenting, you can have a certain set in mind of what it is you're going to do and how you're going to do it. But if you're not really willing to understand that some of those things have to change, because things in society change, and or because of cultural changes, or because your kid isn't exactly what you thought you were going to be getting.
Right.
I mean, I have 4 completely different children, and I couldn't work the same with each one of them.
Right.
My rules stayed the same, but how I got them to get there was completely different.
The concept of equally and equitably is a concept I'm going to teach my kid, and if I have more of my kids, because it's very different. Things aren't, they need to be equitable, but they don't need to be equal.
Yeah.
Right? And that's something we really need to work on teaching our children.
And I think we struggle with that as well. Back to a parent discovering that, okay, something's not right.
Yeah.
How do they know?
There are a lot of red flags. If your child is hanging out with a group of friends and that they don't usually hang out with, if they're being secretive or private, especially around who they're texting, their social media use, all of that. Again, these aren't one-off. If that's happening, your kid is being trapped.
Right.
You're looking at these a whole picture. Find that they have hotel room keys. Those card keys. Mm-hmm. That's a definite red flag. Sex trade is now advertised online, and so often we'll get calls from parents where I found my child's ad. Often their face is not in their ad, but they identify them through knowing their body or knowing a freckle, birthmark sort of thing. If your child has 2 cell phones, that is
those are all good things to know.
Also, if your child has unexplained money or hairdos or clothes or jewelry, it's very important to have conversations about where they got. Nothing can be from an accusatory place, right? Like once you do that, your trust is broken and they feel judged, right?
I mean, they're going to go back to this other person more
that doesn't judge them, and that feels like no matter what you do, I'll love you, right? And so that's what they're looking for. And so if you're like, I love that purse, where did you get it? You know, like that's a really different thing than saying, I didn't give you $50. Where did you buy your purse? Right? So it's about how you have conversations with your kids. But those are ins to have conversations. All of those red flags are ins to have conversations. And then more obvious ones are like branding. Often when you're being trafficked, you're branded with your trafficker's name, like a tattoo of their name, or a symbol. So, I mean, not that you might not know that on your child if they're covering that up, but if they have a tattoo of someone's name, or a symbol that you know, that you might want to ask a question about it, again, without judgment or assumption, but just an end to have a conversation.
All right, so what does a parent do when they suspect? Now, they haven't got proof yet, but they suspect.
I think everything, again, is about a conversation with your kid and without judgment or assumption. So you're going to say, listen, I just saw this video on YouTube, or I just read this article, and, you know, a few of the things that I've noticed are really making me worried about you. I hope I'm totally off base. I hope I'm totally wrong, but I would be a shitty parent if I didn't ask you what's going on. I mean, that's my personality. However, the most sincere way for you to do it with your kid, I get referred clients all the time. And no one had told them why they were referred to me. And so they would tell me stories about their boyfriends or their whatever. And I would say, you can tell me to fuck off, but your boyfriend sounds like a pimp. And if I'm wrong, they think it's so funny. Or they think, oh, Carly, what were you, right? And if I'm right, well, I've created a full end to have a conversation that they were not going to have unless I took that risk. So I think it's parents' jobs and social workers' jobs and to take that risk themselves without judgment or assumption.
Right, but even make themselves look like an idiot if they have to.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that what parenting's about?
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. Between getting peed on, puked on, and now we're the stupid one because we assumed wrong. But that's okay. I'd rather be considered stupid because I assumed wrong and could get to the bottom of something.
You got it.
Right.
You got it.
So give us some key information of how we help them get out of this if they're now in it.
Okay, so the answer is you need to find out what needs are being met by the person. I hate to say this in a way, I don't want it to sound blaming a parent. I don't mean it that way at all. But the majority of people who get trafficked have experienced previous relational trauma. It's trauma that was endured because of their caregivers, because of abuse or neglect. The majority, not all. When you're abused relationally, so by someone that is in a caregiver role, you become much more susceptible to being abused by a trafficker, also in a relational way. Do you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs? You know, if you Google it, it's this triangle, and the bottom it goes through basic needs. The bottom is like physiological needs, right? Like literally roof over your head, food in your belly, clothes on your back. Next level of the triangle is safety, making sure you feel safe, protected, secure. Next level is love and belonging, making sure you feel, unconditionally loved and supported. The last rung, well, there's one after it, but we never get there. That's self-actualization. And in between is self-esteem, making sure you feel, that we equipped our children with the tools so that they can feel like self-sufficient adults when they're older. Most people who are trafficked are not getting all their basic needs met by their caregivers. Not because their caregivers aren't trying, but it's the child's interpretation is that all of their needs are not being met by their caregiver. Comes in, meets all of their needs. You have to figure out what needs they felt like were not being met and meet them. And often you can't do that alone. You need supports to do that. So connecting them with agencies like ours that can help rebuild those supports and reconnect the family to the young person, making sure that they have a new safe place to live if that's not with the parent. Making sure that they have some sort of financial support if that's not through the parent. We don't want that to be through the trafficker, basically. And connecting them with safe, supportive, loving adults who will not judge them so that they can rebuild healthy, secure, empathic, enriched relationships.
So would a family come in for counseling?
I would believe that family counseling would be a very important piece in rebuilding that. Yes, absolutely.
So how does a parent stick to their rules but still give the child what they need if for some reason in the child's brain they perceive that rule to be
not meeting their
needs? How do you do that?
Well, I think the first step is figuring out what the child feels is not being met.
Right.
And then again, a conversation about why are you feeling that's not being met? How would you suggest filling that? If it was simply that and not that the child had experienced previous relational trauma, and I would say, tell me how we can fill that. Let's make a plan together how we can make you feel like that's filled. With
what resources are out there to help them along with it?
So in Ontario, there is a victim service agency in every jurisdiction. So I would say reach out to the victim service agency in your jurisdiction, or an adolescent mental health center in your jurisdiction. And then just do a simple Google search of human trafficking wherever it is you're listening from and live. Because there are tons of resources and materials exist in agencies that are supporting this population now, which is amazing because that's not the way it used to be.
Right.
I can also recommend a website. It's called livingincommunity.ca. If you click on their toolkit, there's a whole toolkit for parents whose children are being exploited like this. Mm-hmm. There's a toolkit for teachers. There's a toolkit for students. It's
awesome.
An incredible resource guide, so check it out.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we could wrap this up,
Mm-hmm.
and there was one thing you wanted to tell parents that you kind of think we have blinders on about, what would it be?
If for whatever reason you felt your basic needs were not being met, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and your caregivers were unable to meet all of your needs for whatever reason, maybe it wasn't their own fault, maybe it was their own trauma, who knows, lack of resources, who knows, trafficker comes along and says, I'm going to make sure you're totally taken care of. Who wouldn't go? It's human nature to get your needs met. It's human nature to survive. So of course you're going to say yes. I need listeners to see it like that. Instead of blaming their kids for hanging out with the wrong people or getting caught up in the wrong crowd or this is not their fault.
Or blaming themselves.
This is not their fault. It is in fact unfair to ask someone to leave their trafficking situation unless you have found replacement ways to meet all of their needs. If you can't meet all of their needs and you try to take somebody out of this, what happens? They go back. That's the most important thing to know. Do not blame your kids if this is happening to them. It will not be helpful in any way, and it is in fact not their fault. They might say they said yes, but they did not really consent.
And so if we are suspecting, does that mean chances are?
Yes, it's one of those things that if you have a suspicion this is happening, you're likely right.
And so find out.
Find out, and take the risk yourself. Don't be scared to ask questions even if you're wrong, and don't blame them and don't judge them and don't have assumptions, but ask them because you love them and because you want to keep your kids safe.
Yeah, we're going to wrap it up with that. I think that last statement there pretty much sums up parenting, like across the board in everything that we do. If we could remember that they are human beings and expect to be cared and treated with decency, kindness, love, unconditional love, then we're doing our job. But I'd love to end this with making sure that you understand that if you've made mistakes, and as you've heard today, I obviously have made some mistakes.
Hasn't?
Exactly. That's actually why one of my books is called I Was the Perfect Parent and Then I Had Kids, because we all make mistakes. Don't beat yourself up about it, because it's not about you or what you did right or wrong. It's about fixing it. So get on the bandwagon with your child. Start having those conversations that Carly was talking about. Go back and watch this again and listen to her examples of how she approached those, because they were perfect, and try to suit that for you and your child. Because really, when it comes right down to it, the bottom line is not who's right or wrong, but that your child is taken care of. As always, we want to wish you an awesome day.